Hey there, folks. Welcome to Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. My name is Joshua Bissell, and I'm the producer of this weekly podcast where we tackle topics around abuse prevention and vulnerable sector protection. We're continuing our series in lead up to our trauma care conference at the end of October. Please do join us for that conference. We'd love to see you there. Melodie's unpacking the term trauma today. Obviously, this can be quite a sensitive subject for some of you, so please take that advisement under consideration. Thank you again for joining us for Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. Here's Melodie.
Hello. Do you remember a time in your life that you encountered some form of trauma? One of the memories I have of my childhood is walking home from my friend's home. It was dusk. The sun was going down. There was about 20 to 30 houses between her house and my house. We lived on the same street. As I was walking home, I realized that there was a car that was driving very slowly behind me as I walked along the sidewalk. He didn't pass me. He drove very slowly beside me. I was coming up to my house and I could feel a little bit of fear and a little bit of panic knowing this car was driving so slowly. As I came up to my house and I was just about to cut in, he swung his car over to my side of the road, unrolled his window, and encouraged me to get into his car and started to open up his door. I felt great fear at that point, great panic, and I ran inside my house. Thankfully, I was right in front of my house at the time that he swung over to try to lure me into his car. That was one incident, but I still remember that day and still remember the fear and panic that I experienced that day walking home. The definition we're going to tackle today is this term trauma. And at Plan to Protect, we hear about a lot of stories, a lot of incidences that have caused some form of trauma in an individual's life. Any form of critical incident, in many, many cases, would cause trauma to an individual. Even walking through a critical incident or a crisis could initiate trauma in the lives of program leaders and those that are having to navigate that crisis. That pales in comparison to the trauma that the victim experienced. Last week, we talked about this definition of victim survivor. Today, I'm going to just briefly introduce to you the topic of trauma. This is, again, setting the stage for a virtual mini conference that we are offering on October 28th, 2021. We invite you to register. If you register before the end of September, you get our early bird pricing. I'm only touching the surface of what our guest speakers and myself will be talking about as we talk about trauma care. Trauma care on behalf of the individual that has experienced some form of trauma, but also trauma care for those of you that are walking alongside and providing care, whether that be friendship, family, pastoral care, community care in the lives of those that have experienced trauma. We are also quickly approaching Truth and Reconciliation Day in Canada, a day that is now set aside to remember the atrocities that happened in residential schools. As a country, as a nation, we have a responsibility to now provide care to those that experienced the trauma within residential schools. We've talked about this topic before on our podcast, and we will continue to talk about this topic of providing trauma care to those that have been impacted by historical abuse or individual incidences of abuse. Trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, abuse, rape, or even a natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. People begin to question, did that really occur? Did that happen to me? Was I to blame? Why did that happen? Why did God allow that to happen? Longer term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headaches and nausea. A traumatic event is an incident that causes physical, emotional, spiritual, or psychological harm. The person experiencing the distressing event may physically feel threatened or extremely frightened as a result, which was the case that I felt when this person tried to lure me into his car. I've never quite felt comfortable walking along the side of a road now when the sun is setting because I remember that day so many years ago. There are 3 types of trauma, and at the Trauma Care Conference, we're going to unpack these more. But the 3 main types of trauma are acute trauma, chronic trauma, or complex trauma. Acute trauma results from a single incident. So I experienced acute trauma that day that I felt such fear, such panic, feeling that that man was going to get me. Chronic trauma is repeated and prolonged, such as domestic violence or prolonged abuse that an individual experiences. Complex trauma is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature. Children that experience abuse often experience complex trauma. It's often not just one type of abuse, but it can be many different types of abuse. Individuals that experience abuse with alarming frequency, and that number continues to increase in the United States and Canada and globally. According to research, 1 in every 3 women will be sexually abused before they are 16 years of age, and 1 in 4 men will experience some form of sexual violence that includes physical contact at some point in their lives. Additionally, survivors of sexual abuse and other forms of child abuse have an increased likelihood of being assaulted at other times in their adulthood. Those statistics come from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. According to Mayo Clinic, to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder, your doctor will likely perform a physical examination to check for medical problems that may be caused by your symptoms. They may also do a psychological evaluation that includes a discussion of your signs and symptoms and indicators and the event or events that led up to them. PTSD is a medical diagnosis. Not everyone that experiences a trauma will be diagnosed with PTSD. If you are having symptoms of trauma, you may be diagnosed with this condition. However, it is important to remember that not all traumatic experiences will lead to that diagnosis of a trauma-related condition. It does not mean that the event did not happen or that there was impact because of that event. Although someone may not develop PTSD, they may still experience PTSD like symptoms immediately after the traumatic event. Many of these symptoms are actually common reactions to any form of traumatic event. I'm going to give you just a few of those symptoms. And again, we're going to unpack this so much more in our trauma care conference that we will be offering in October. These are just a few of the symptoms, few of the umbrella symptoms that you may experience. If you have experienced a traumatic event, be aware of the following symptoms: body aches, fatigue, flashbacks, headaches, insomnia, nightmares, night terrors, intrusive symptoms, avoidance symptoms, increased arousal, changes in your thoughts and your feelings. One of those is feeling unsafe. After a traumatic event, our assumptions about the world and the safety of our world and the secure place that we are in is understandably shattered. Consequently, people may feel as though situations or places are potentially dangerous. Places or situations you once felt secure in may now feel very threatening and may cause anxiety. This is especially likely to occur in situations or places that remind you of that traumatic event. You may also find yourself experiencing or experimenting with unhealthy coping behaviors. Just as avoidance of some activities may take place, people can be problematic. So can the avoidance of our thoughts and feelings. These symptoms people experience once they have experienced a traumatic event can be very distressing. As a result, people rely on unhealthy coping strategies. For example, experimenting with substance abuse. These are ways that we avoid the symptoms of fear and anxiety, of avoiding even having to deal with it through our emotions and our thoughts. Avoidance is only a short-term solution, and in the long run, it can actually cause your feelings and your thoughts to become more intense, to exacerbate the issue. Considerable attention has been paid to the immediate and long-term effects of abuse and trauma, notably about the impact on psychological functioning. It's so important that we respond correctly if we have experienced a trauma and we show evidence of any of those indicators, or someone in our lives, amongst our family, our friends, our community, is showing signs of trauma. As part of my doctoral thesis, I did so much reading about the impact of trauma, the impact of abuse on an individual's life. Theologian Lucian Richard contends that the severity of spiritual suffering as a result of abuse is one of the most serious forms of suffering. It consists in relationship of feeling violated by someone that we may have a strong relationship with, or even feeling that we have been violated by God. It's a form of alienation, of betrayal, of deep abandonment. One outcome of spiritual impact of abuse is the loss of hope. I can't imagine living a life without hope. Phil Silas speaks to this issue. He quotes Simone Weil's essay, The Love of God and Affliction. She speaks to this suffering that suffocates hope. When these facets are present, Will identifies that there are three dimensions of that suffering: physical pain, which is a physical torment and illness in the body; psychological anguish, a severe experience of trauma to the human heart because of the human capacity to hope is suffocated by the traumatic and blinding realities of the psychological torment and anxiety, the fear, the grief, the shame, the physical numbness that can take over and play a toll on the capacity for human being to bear under that suffering. And the third type is social degradation, that sense of abandonment, rejection, and forsakenness. And often individuals that have experienced some form of trauma feel that abandonment, that rejection, and that forsakenness by family, friends, their community, and even God. Here are just a few things that you can do if you have experienced some form of trauma. Again, I'm just touching the surface. We're going to unpack this so much more in our full day conference. First off, validate your feelings. Don't feel that you have to force yourself to talk to others about how you feel. However, it is important that you validate to yourself what you are feeling. If you are ready, find a support group where you can talk to other people that you feel safe with that may have experienced a similar type of experience. Give yourself time to deal with what you are feeling. Don't expect those feelings to go away overnight. In the meantime, take it easy on yourself. Take care of your body. Eat well. Get some physical exercise. Go outside for a walk. Spend time with the safe people, family, and friends in your life. Try to maintain some of your routines. Keep a journal. As I researched the impact of spiritual abuse and healing among victim survivors of child sexual abuse, I found 5 out of 6 of my participants had found great source of peace and hope and healing as a result of journaling. If you have not experienced a trauma, but someone in your life has experienced some form of trauma, I really encourage you to refer the individual to a professional counselor. It is so important that the sooner they can get into a professional counselor or therapist that is trained to deal with that form of trauma, the more successful they will be in finding healing. Be a friend, a safe friend. Listen to them. Verbalize your belief in what has happened. Rachel Den Hollander says the most important things we can say to a victim survivor of child abuse is, I believe you, and I am so sorry this happened to you. Enter into a time of sorrow and lament with that individual. If they are at that stage in their life and in their healing journey, don't rush them through to find immediate healing and restoration. Allow them to experience and be present in their sorrow, their sadness, and the lament. Their innocence has been robbed from them. And finally, and we're going to unpack this so much more in the conference, is take care of yourself. Vicarious trauma is a very real thing. And we're going to be unpacking that so much more in a full session in our conference. Today, we have tackled the topic of trauma. What is trauma? The different types of trauma, indicators of trauma, and just some basic ways to care for yourself and others that have experienced trauma. Join us next week. Thanks for joining me today. Take care. Bye.